Hello and welcome to She Rises. This is a podcast for Christian women who love God but are tired of living in survival mode and want more than another promise of peace. Here we explore foundations, identity and biblical worldview, learning how to rebuild wisely so our lives and homes are shaped by truth rather than reaction and steadiness rather than strain. I'm Joanne Hewlett and I'm so glad that you're here. Now, last week, we began looking at Jesus' simple story about two houses, both built by people who heard his words, both exposed to the same storm, and yet only one remained steady. The difference wasn't intention, it was foundation. Now, if you think about a house built in a windy area, you might design it with the assumption that gusts will come. That's not wrong. But if everything in the structure is constantly under tension, always prepared for impact, the whole building begins to carry a subtle strain. It functions, it stands, but it's rarely at rest. And I've noticed this in myself over the years, that subtle internal tightening when something unexpected happens, a change of plan, a misunderstanding or a delay. It's not dramatic. Well, sometimes it is. I don't necessarily fall apart, but there is a moment of bracing as though my inner walls are adjusting to the pressure before I've even consciously chosen how to respond. And I began to realize that bracing isn't the same as maturity. Survival can look remarkably responsible. It can look like over-preparing so nothing goes wrong. It can look like anticipating everyone's needs before they speak. It can look like busyness that feels productive but is actually protective. It can even look like strong opinions held tightly because certainty feels safer than uncertainty. Have you ever found yourself reacting faster than you meant to and then thinking later that was sharper than it needed to be? Or perhaps going quiet and withdrawing, not because you don't care, but because staying silent feels safer than engaging honestly. Survival doesn't always shout. Sometimes it simply tightens. And here's where culture quietly feeds it. We're applauded for being busy. We're praised for being emotionally expressive. We're encouraged to speak our truth immediately, to trust our feelings instinctively, to respond quickly and confidently. But rarely are we taught the discipline of pause. Rarely are we formed in the slow work of obedience. In that environment, survival can masquerade as strength, but spiritual maturity is something different. When Jesus speaks about building on rock, he doesn't say, blessed is the one who hears. He says the wise builder is the one who hears and puts his words into practice. There is a forming that must take place, a shaping, a steady alignment. Spiritual maturity is not measured by how intensely you feel or how confidently you speak or how many Christian resources you consume. It's measured by what has been quietly built into your structure over time. It's the difference between reacting and responding, between intensity and steadiness, between managing outcomes and trusting God's character. And that formation rarely happens accidentally. We often learn survival early, long before we had language for it. We learn what keeps the peace. We learn what earns approval. We learn how to avoid conflict or control it. None of that makes us villains. It simply means we adapted. But adaptation is not the same as maturity. Maturity requires choosing consciously to build differently. Now, our culture runs on immediacy, immediate opinion, immediate reaction, and immediate validation. But the Sermon on the Mount invites something slower. It calls us to humility, restraint, hidden obedience, forgiveness, and trust. These are not reactive traits, they're formed ones. So if you find that peace feels fragile when pressure rises, it may not be because you lack faith. It may be because parts of your structure were shaped more by cultural currents than by Christ's words. That's not an accusation, it's an opportunity because foundations can be strengthened. There's a profound difference between living braced and living built. Bracing anticipates a threat. Building anticipates obedience. Bracing asks, how do I protect myself? Building asks, what does faithfulness look like here? One tightens, the other steadies. And the beautiful thing is that spiritual maturity is not reserved for a certain personality type. It's cultivated through small repeated acts of obedience, choosing to pause before reacting, choosing to submit feelings to truth, choosing to respond in alignment with Christ, even when instinct pulls elsewhere. That is foundation work, and it changes the feel of the whole house. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, yes, I recognize that bracing in myself and I don't want to live that way anymore, this is exactly the kind of work we walk through inside Rise and Restore. It's not about adding pressure or piling on expectations. It's a guided space where we gently examine identity, align our thinking with scripture, and strengthen foundations in a structured, steady way. Now, if this series is stirring something in you, that may be the next practical step. I'll leave the details in the show notes, along with the podcast code if you'd like to join. Now, this week's gentle nudge, when you notice that internal tightening, that instinct to brace, pause for a moment before you act. Ask yourself quietly, is this survival speaking or maturity forming? You don't need to solve it immediately, just notice. Awareness is often the first reinforcement in the foundation. Next week, we'll look more closely at what sand can look like in modern Christian life, the subtle assumptions we build on without realizing, and how to begin replacing them with something steadier. Until next time, live steadily, think deeply, and keep building wisely.